following podcast is taken from a webinar presented by Dr. Lance Baumgard from Iowa State University, titled Who Let the Dogma Out of Transition Cow Management? To view the full webinar and access the slides referenced during this podcast, visit balchem.com/realscience and use the search bar to jump down to this webinar presented on January 10th of 2023.
I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the way my group has been thinking about the transition period for the last 10 or so years. Who let the dogma out? Actually, I need a shout out to a friend of mine, Stephen LeBlanc. Stephen and I were on another meeting together in Canada a few weeks ago, and he was talking about some of our ideas and papers, and he mentioned who let the dogma out. So I got to give him credit and maybe pay him some royalties on the title. Okay, let's get into it. I like these a couple quotes, especially because I think most of us on this webinar are probably familiar with Claude Bernard and his contributions to the concepts of homeostasis. And of course, Bauman utilized a lot of Bernard's thoughts on homeostasis when he developed the whole concept of homeoresis. So it's what we think we know that keeps us from learning, I think is important, and we should not forget it. So oftentimes nutritionists are blamed for transition cow problems, and in particular, cows that have high NEFAs or they're hyperketonemia, or if they're subclinically hypocalcemic. And I think these are really due to one of two things. One, these are high productive, healthy cows. They're profitable. And in this scenario, the nutritionist deserves a raise. Or they are a reflection of immune activation, the metabolic reflection of immune activation, likely stemming from typical ailments that transition cows experience, like metritis, mastitis, pneumonia, and possibly GI tract inflammation. And I think these are mostly management issues, not necessarily a nutrition issue. Everything I'm talking about today we go in much more detail in this particular review, written with two of my former PhD students, Aaron Horst and Sarah Kavidra. So if you are interested in learning more about exactly what I'm talking about, this is a nice, I'm biased. I think this is a nice review that explains the way we think. Quick reminder of how important glucose is. So as the nutritionist, they're balancing rations to maximize efficient fermentation, and in particular generation of propionic acid. This 3-carbon volatile fatty acid is used as the primary precursor to gluconeogenesis occurring in the liver. And the reason why this monosaccharide is so important is because it's the primary precursor to lactose. In milk lactose, this disaccharide is the primary, not the only, but the primary osmotic regulator of milk yield. So this particular pathway is very important for profitability of the dairy cow. And of course, this is in large part influenced by the nutritionist, but also, as you find out later in the talk, by immune activation. And it takes about 72 grams of glucose to make 1 kilogram of milk. Okay.
The economics of feeding Reassure precision release choline. Reassure is fed during the transition period, and because it's fed for such a short period of time, it costs just $15 per cow. And yet the benefits will continue to generate income throughout the year. Cows fed Reassure produce 5 pounds more colostrum, which pays for your Reassure investment on the very first day of lactation. Cows fed Reassure also produce 5 pounds more milk per day, every day. That means after the first day, every day is payday. Invest in Reassure during the transition period and recoup your investment on the very first day of lactation. After that, you got it, payday.
So the foundation of our thinking and essentially everything moving forward in today's lecture comes back to these concepts. The best indicators of health are feed intake and milk yield. If everyone agrees that stress reduces productivity, then high productivity cannot be stressful. The idea that high milk production is stressful, then it becomes an oxymoron. And I think we have oftentimes overthunk, right? made the immune system more complex than maybe what it really needs to be. I don't think we need a PhD or a DVM to know when a cow is healthy. If they're milking well and eating well, they are healthy. And another thing you'll see permeating the entire seminar is that Mother Nature is rarely wrong. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about pathological diseases. I'm talking about normal biology, the evolution of why and how an animal metabolically adapts to whatever type of stress or challenge is rarely wrong. And I don't think we should view it as being pathological. And another one is inconsistent and reproducible data should create doubts. When scientific papers do not agree, and they don't agree for decades on decades, then that should create a scenario where we become skeptical of whatever it is that we're evaluating. Okay, you've seen slides like this. This is a classic slide here produced by the University of Minnesota Vet School, looking at day of lactation on the x-axis and the likelihood of leaving the herd or culling on the left y-axis. And of course, we know that about a very large percentage of the cows are culled prior to 60 days in milk. And Jim Drakely wrote a paper now that's over 20 years ago talking about the transition period. And in North America, only about 50% of the cows get through the transition period without experiencing one of these negative outcomes. And this is that paper I'm talking about. And if you're interested in the transition period, you've probably read this paper. And if you haven't, you need to. It is the Bible of transition period metabolism. And Jose Santos and his group wrote another review recently, or more recently, 2010, and he came down with the same thing. About 44% of the transition cows get one of these problems, right? Calving, metritis, etc. So it's obviously a huge issue, and the transition period success then in large part dictates the overall profitability of that particular lactation. So in graduate school, I remember reading papers like this, and right, we had some pioneers of dairy science, the godfathers of dairy science on this particular paper. But I remember reading it and having all these particular negative outcomes correlated with each other. And even back in the mid-90s when I was reading these papers, I'm like, okay, are all these seemingly unrelated transition periods disorders and diseases, are they actually biologically connected, or are they just mathematically, or is it just simply a mathematical nuance? Now, I'm going to come back to this slide later because I don't think it's just mathematical nuance. I actually think it's real biology. So we're all familiar with the transition period and the negative energy balances associated with it. And this is a slide I stole from the Alberta Dairy Management website, but it is looking at here in the purple line, where milk, the energy output in milk coupled with maintenance cost exceeds that in the early stages of lactation of energy consumption, the dry matter intake. So the animal's in negative energy balance. And this negative energy balance lasts typically between 30 and 60 days in milk. Okay. And this is a paper, or this is a slide I got from one of Rick Rummer's presentations, just demonstrating the energy balance on the y-axis stays relative to calving. And we're all familiar with this, right? In reality, it probably comes back into positive energy balance maybe like 2 or 3 weeks later than day 21. And because of this lack of energy consumption, which you see here in the purple line, the animal has to compensate for that energy insufficiencies by mobilizing adipose tissue, and non-esterified fatty acids increase. Now, this increase in non-esterified fatty acids is something that we have been very interested in for now probably going on 4 decades, because we assume that this increase in blood non-esterified fatty acids is responsible or causes negative outcomes. So this is a slide that I've adapted from one of Jim Drakely's presentations and papers. Here we have adipose tissue, and adipose tissue is mobilized during negative energy balance. So the triglycerides are hydrolyzed into non-esterified fatty acids, and non-esterified fatty acids then increase in circulation. And importantly, this is accompanied by a decrease in insulin concentrations and a decrease in insulin action or sensitivity, coupled with some increase in stress hormones. Now, non-esterified fatty acids then are utilized by a variety of tissues that have the capacity to do so, but in this particular example, we're talking about what happens at the liver. It can be reconverted back into a triglyceride and hopefully exported as VLDL, or it can be stored, and that's something we probably want to minimize, the storage of hepatic triglycerides. It can be oxidized, brought into the mitochondria by CPT1 and 2, and hopefully then if it is brought into the mitochondria, it is completely oxidized to CO2 and water and for the generation of ATP. If it's partially oxidized, well, then it's kicked out of the mitochondria as ketones. Okay, so now for a long time, like I said, probably 4 decades, we've had this this assumption that non-certified fatty acids and ketones are causing many of the transition cal problems. And the reason why we believe that is because there are hundreds of studies in Journal of Dairy Science and other scientific journals that associate non-certified fatty acids, BHBs, and calcium with negative outcomes. And I listed here 5 or 6 different papers by people that I respect and admire, and they're friends of mine. I could have listed, like I said, about 100 of these papers, and probably every dairy scientist listening to this webinar has published data that is consistent with this, right? That the magnitude of NEFAs and BHBs and hypocalcemia are sometimes, not always, it's important, correlated with a negative outcome. But importantly, like I just kind of hinted to, there are many papers that do not demonstrate a correlation or association with these in negative outcomes. And I think that's really important. So then when you start thinking about the metabolism then of parturition and early lactation amongst all females, not just cows, we know that mobilization of adipose tissue is an incredibly important metabolic aspect to lactation. Almost all cows have a relatively high circulating concentrations of NEFA following calving. So then with regards to, in this particular instance, ketosis, what explains why some cows, or in fact a majority of cows, can get through the transition period while having high NEFAs but not getting ketosis? And maybe what makes more cows more susceptible to ketosis or more susceptible to developing fatty liver, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And I think it is presumptuous of us to think that we can utilize one metabolite to diagnose a disease. And I think that's it's classically referred to as the reductionist approach that I think has issues and gets us in trouble, potentially gets us in trouble. Okay. The incidence of health problems, like I showed you earlier from that University of Minnesota slide, the incidence of health problems is highest in the first month of lactation. Everyone agrees with that. No one disputes that. But here's what we also know. The largest swings in energetic metabolites, insulin, glucose, NEFAs, ketones, hormones like insulin, glucagon, cortisol, growth hormone, and minerals like calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. All of these that I just mentioned, and many more that I haven't, the largest swings in an entire dairy cow's life happens within a very short window of time, within the first 2, 3, 4 weeks of lactation. So as a consequence, you have then an enormous amount of moving parts, all occurring simultaneously. So then now it's a matter of just mathematics that you're going to, all of these things that are moving quickly, and then they're going to be correlated or associated mathematically with a negative outcome. And of course, we all know this, right? Causality and correlation are incorrectly interchanged when these two events happen at the same time, and they're claimed to be inevitable rather than just simply coincidence. And this is just a silly example of kind of what I'm talking about. Clearly, this seagull didn't bend the pipe, but maybe more important or more enlightening of this idea is this particular cartoon. Here we have the sun, hot, sunny day. And during the hot, sunny days, people are more likely to eat ice cream. So this is a cause and effect. Hot weather increases ice cream consumption. Here's what we also know, that hot weather also increases your likelihood of getting a sunburn. So here I have a causation and a causation. Now the ice cream is correlated with being a sunburn. So clearly, eating ice cream doesn't cause you to have a sunburn, and no one would ever claim that it did. But you can see here then how mathematically ice cream consumption would be correlated with getting a sunburn. And I think this has an enormous amount of implications. It can be transferred into our transition period issues. So this correlation then interpretation causes suspect decision-making and unnecessary farm expenses for our producers. So the traditional belief, if we assume that correlation equals causation, is that increased NEFAs, hyperketonemia, and hypocalcemia cause. Okay, this is important. It's not just academic nuance. But increased NEFAs, hyperketonemia, and subclinical hypocalcemia cause problems. Okay, and you end up getting models that are built like this, and we've all seen many types of models like this, where you have negative energy balance, like I mentioned earlier, impairing reproduction. Right here over on the left, you have a variety of cause and effects on reproduction. Then you have increased liver or impaired liver function, RPs, endometritis, a variety of obviously ketosis. So here we have a cause and effect model of negative energy balance causing problems. And this is another one I just grabbed from the internet. Here we have ketosis causing problems like metritis, cystic ovaries, RPs, reduced milk production, increased culling, fertility, etc. And you've all seen cartoons like this or models made like this. So the question is how, and maybe more importantly, why would NEFAs, hyperketonemia, and hypocalcemia cause problems? What would be the biological plausibility? In other words, why would evolution favor a scenario where the mother mobilizes tissues or makes metabolic adjustments to help feed her young, but at the same time put herself in a compromising position where she's more likely to get sick and thus more likely to not be able to take care of her young? It doesn't, I don't think that makes sense. So I think there's very little mechanistic evidence to suggest that NEFAs, ketones, and calcium can directly have such a large influence on very seemingly unconnected systems and diseases. The best line is probably extrapolated from the purported role in immune suppression, an area of research that Dr. Mark Curley at the USDA initiated and is the grandfather of. This immune suppression caused by NEFAs, ketones, and hypocalcemia, really a pioneer in the area. And like I said, there are papers that demonstrate some ex vivo, most of the time ex vivo assessment of hypocalcemia, high levels of NEFAs and hyperketonemia on leukocyte function, oftentimes neutrophil function. But importantly, back to that early foundation of the way we think, there's a lot of inconsistencies in the data. Actually, Stephen LeBlanc's group did a nice job of highlighting this in a nice review almost 3 years ago now. And remember, the foundation of any dogma should be a consistent pattern of data, a reproducibility of data. So this immune suppression and negative energy balance then creates models. Like here we have a model where you got immune suppression on top and negative energy balance on the bottom. And then these things cause problems. They cause mastitis, they cause RPs, they cause metritis, ovarian dysfunction, ketosis, DAs, milk fever, etc. See, they're all connected. And this is what I guess we're trying to challenging now for a long time. So if hyperketonemia and high NEFAs and subclinical hypocalcemia are pathological, in other words, they're causing disease, it stands to reason then that therapeutically treating these disorders would improve overall cow health, right? That makes sense. If hyperketonemia is bad, it causes disease. If we treat the hyperketonemia, it should prevent disease. Well, here we have the NOMS report, 1996, 2002, and 2014, and have different culling reasons on the left column. And in large part, other than clinical milk fever, there's very little suggestions that overall herd health is improving with time. Okay, so despite the time, emphasis, and money spent on high NEFAs, hyperketonemia, and subclinical hypocalcemia, arguably, not even arguably, pretty emphatically, you can say that herd health is not improving. So maybe we're just medicating the wrong things, right? If we spent the last 40 years trying to prevent subclinical hypocalcemia and 40 years trying to prevent hyperketonemia, then maybe we're not medicating the right thing. So here's a traditional belief that increased NEFAs and hyperketonemia and hypocalcemia cause production and health problems. So the model kind of looks like this. And this was put together by one of my former PhD students, Aaron Horst. The cow calves, she gets subclinical hypocalcemic. She has high levels of NEFAs, which then are converted into the ketones by the liver, and you end up getting ketosis. Importantly, the changes in these three metabolites are thought to reduce feed intake, which then contributes to DA. And again, importantly, the high NEFAs, the BHBs, and the hypocalcemia cause immune suppression. And once immune suppression is established, well, then that increases the risk of the cows getting pneumonia, mastitis, metritis, RP, etc. And importantly, these three have also been connected with impaired reproduction, ultimately decreased farm profitability. Okay, so that's the traditional dogma of the transition period. So I want to take some time to kind of dissect through these. Maybe a critical evaluation of it. So ketosis dogma, excessive adipose tissue mobilization causes fatty liver and ketosis, and that this is a bigger problem in high-producing dairy cows. And because of this, we've had an academic and an industry goal now for a very long time of reducing adipose tissue mobilization. I think there's a variety of things that should have given us red flags and should have caused us to have pause a long time ago. One is, I've already talked about the associations and correlations. There are very few intervening experimentations looking at how NEFAs and ketones can do this. If you infuse ketones or NEFAs into a variety of different animals, it doesn't cause these negative outcomes. Remember, animals naturally ebb and flow out of ketosis all the time and have been for the last millennia. Interestingly, many ketotic cows are not hypoinsulinemic. And in fact, oftentimes are hyperinsulinemic, an endocrine profile that goes against everything we think we know about the metabolic profile, the hormonal profile of ketosis. Ketones do not reduce feed intake. You hear this a lot. If this was the case, of course, then a starving animal would not have an appetite, and that would, quicken their demise. If you reduce adipose tissue mobilization, which can be done pharmaceutically, we can give cows insulin injections, and or we can give them a TZD, which is a molecule that improves insulin sensitivity, and oftentimes type 2 diabetics might be on a TZD. Anyway, if you give insulin or a TZD, that does markedly reduce adipose tissue mobilization, but accompanying this reduction in NEFAs and hyperketonemia is a marked reduction in milk yield. Some female animals don't consume food after parturition. This is some deer, some ocean mammals don't. A blue whale will literally lose 5 metric ton of adipose tissue during lactation. And importantly, what's really sparked my interest in this whole area is the regional differences in the rate of clinical ketosis. I was at the University of Arizona from 2001 to 2009. And was shocked to learn that the clinical rates of ketosis in Arizona are less than 1%. Some dairy producers in Arizona haven't treated a ketotic cow for decades, which always surprised me, right? Because Arizona has high milk production. They're a very progressive state, and maybe 5 to 6 months of heat stress. If any area of the country should have a ketosis problem, you would anticipate that Arizona would be one of them, or probably the primary one, but it just simply doesn't. So just a quick reminder, hyperketonemia and ketogenesis in general is the coordinated convergence of carbohydrate and lipid metabolism. And I'll show you that in a second. It's a highly conserved amongst almost all mammals. There's some ocean mammals that might have an exception. It's such an ancient strategy that even the simplest organisms like microbes will organize and utilize store adipose tissue, store excess energy as triglycerides, mobilize them, and convert them into ketones. I think claiming that hyperketonemia is a disease is akin to saying hyperglycemia is the pathological origin of diabetes. In other words, when someone has type 1 diabetes, they are typically hyperglycemic. People don't blame the hyperglycemia for the problem. They blame the lack of circulating insulin. And I think the same concepts then can apply to transition cow hyperketonemia. There are now millions of people that are on low carbohydrate ketogenic diets. And so many people that are on it that dozens of papers now have been written about the health consequences of a ketogenic diet. And meta-analysis papers are being written about them. Here's just two examples. This is a 2020 paper looking at the ketogenic diet on metabolism and obesity in overweight people without type 2 diabetes. And here's just another 2020 paper looking at the meta-analysis of the ketogenic diet on human health. Listen, we literally have hundreds of millions of people in the world that have been on ketogenic diets or low carbohydrate diets now for years, some of them decades. If hyperketonemia was going to be causing health problems, we would have identified this in the human population. So interestingly, probably in history's most famous biochemist, Hans Krebs, was interested in bovine ketosis, and he wrote many papers on bovine ketosis. And our understanding of the ketogenesis actually, in large part, comes from Hans Krebs. So fatty acids coming from adipose tissue come into the hepatocyte, go through beta oxidation, generates a lot of acetyl-CoA. Now, normally, this acetyl-CoA would enter into the TCA cycle by combining with oxaloacetate, this 4-carbon molecule, to generate citrate. But during early lactation, the animal is also hypoglycemic. So there's a huge increase in the rates of gluconeogenesis. So as a consequence of that, oxaloacetate is leaving the TCA cycle in the process of one of the initial steps of gluconeogenesis to make glucose. Consequently, there's inadequate quantities of oxaloacetate for acetyl-CoA to combine with. In other words, acetyl-CoA being produced from beta oxidation of fatty acids originating from adipose tissue can't get into the TCA cycle. Well, that's okay, because what happens then is that the acetyl-CoA is converted into these 3 ketones and exits the liver, and that can be utilized for energy for pretty much all other tissues. Now, I mentioned homeostasis and Dale Bauman earlier. This is a 1980 paper. If you are interested in whatever I'm talking about today, this is 20 years before Jim Drakely's transition period paper, but it's a must read if you have interest in dairy cow metabolism. And Dale and I and Bob Collier wrote a paper now 6 years ago, again, reviewing homeostasis. And then Sarah and I and Aaron wrote another paper, which I mentioned earlier. If you have an interest in this type of biology, I would encourage you to read these 3 papers. Ultimately, though, one of the main conclusions of these 3 papers is that the mobilization of adipose tissue and the partial conversion of these non-esterified fatty acids into ketones is absolutely essential for maximum milk yield. If you prevent this from happening, it will come at the cost of milk. And a common critique of our message by some of my colleagues is, well, listen, you mentioned that milk yield is a gauge of overall animal health. And yes, I firmly believe that. And so when you give propylene glycol to a cow that is subclinical hyperketonemic, SHK, well, then they produce more milk. And that's been demonstrated 3 times. 2 out of the 3 farms in a 2011 paper, and another 2 papers demonstrating the same thing. But importantly, there's been no effect of propylene glycol on milk yield in subclinical hyperketonemic cows in these 3 papers. So, right, it's about a 50-50. So the body evidence, I don't think, supports the practice of giving subclinical hyperketonemic cows propylene glycol yet. So transition period and insulin, high-producing cows are more hypoinsulinemic compared to their low-producing herd mates. The transition period insulin concentrations is inversely related to whole lactation performance. In other words, you can predict an animal's overall lactation performance based upon an insulin concentration in a transition period. Removal of insulin from the circulating pool, that is increased by genetic selection for milk yield. And if you give insulin or insulin sensitizing agent, it decreases milk yield. In other words, the primary endocrine profile required for high production, profitable production, is hypoinsulinemia. Okay, that's important. You see in a second. So the successful transition cow, she has propionate coming out of the rumen converted in the liver to glucose. Now the successful cow becomes the hyperglycemia is unable to stimulate a lot of insulin concentration, insulin secretion. So now the animal is hypoinsulinemic. This hypoinsulinemia, coupled with an increase in insulin resistance, allows adipose tissue to be mobilized. Non-esterified fatty acids in circulation go up. They can be utilized by energy by most cell types within the carcass. There's importantly a couple cell types that can't oxidize NEFAs. And that's okay, because then we can convert that energy in NEFAs into a ketone. Now, most of the carcass can burn one of these two fuels for the generation of ATP. And what that allows then is the sparing, or essentially the lack of having to use glucose for energy by other tissues. Now it can be utilized by the mammary gland to make milk. And Alan Bell's group did a fantastic job of putting some numbers to this. And it's like 95% of the amount of glucose leaving the liver in a healthy transition cow is utilized by the mammary gland. This is a super highway, right? It's the Autobahn from the liver to the mammary gland for the synthesis of milk. This all occurs, this metabolic flexibility occurs because of a decrease in insulin sensitivity. Now, we'll come back to the unsuccessful transition cow in a minute. We now know that there's inflammation, there's immune activation that occurs in the transition cow. And in large part, we know this because of the Italian group. Bertoni and Murnio Trevisi's groups in Italy have done a fantastic job of characterizing and describing this inflammatory inflammation that occurs after calving. And they've done a great job of extending that to show that there's an increase in inflammation at dry off. And one of my graduate students, Brady Gates, has reconfirmed this in some work here at Iowa State University. But the source of this inflammation in the transition period, the two obvious ones are the mammary gland, because we know the incidence of mastitis is highest in early lactation. The uterus, of course. We think the GI tract is a source of some of this inflammation, which I don't have time to talk about today. But more importantly then is, okay, what are the consequences of this immune activation that's occurring? So here's just an oversimplified cartoon of looking at the the intestine. We have lipopolysaccharide, which is a very potent antigen. Normally doesn't get through the barrier function of the epithelium of the gut, but in some cases it can. And what it does then is immediately attacked by acute phase protein called LPS binding protein. And this LBP then will chaperone the LPS to an immune cell. In this particular example, it's a resident macrophage in the liver called a Kupffer cell. And in the process of detoxifying this LPS, you have an inflammation. And what we've been measuring a lot about is often is acute phase proteins, haptoglobin, LBP, and serum amyloid A. This is a fantastic some work done by Gerd Bobe's group. And what they did was they blood sampled cows through the transition period from -21 to 28 days. And then once the cows got to 100 days in milk, they retroclassified them as being healthy cows, cows that had mild disease, severe disease, or if they were culled or died. Again, haptoglobin, which is acute phase protein, a marker of immune activation, is on the y-axis. So even the cows that had no problems, they had no overt health problems, have an inflammation after calving. That's important to note, is that all animals have a mild inflammation after calving. What was interesting to me is that if the cows didn't make it to 100 days in milk, if they were culled or died before 100 days in milk, they were retrospectively classified as purple. So we're talking about cows that were culled or died at 50, 75, 100 days in milk. And you could go all the way back to the first couple of days of lactation, and they were severely inflamed. On the right, you have looking at haptoglobin again on the y-axis and looking at metritis, mildly or severe metritis. And it's the same story. Even healthy cows have an inflammatory response, but this severe immune activation occurs before the clinical presentation of the disease. This is one of my students, Amir Nerieri and Nathan Upal. They looked at ketosis. So the clinical ketosis was diagnosed between about days 9 and 20 of milk by a good friend of mine, Pat Gordon, a faculty member in the vet school. And so they're showing signs of clinical ketosis out here. But if you took a look at their blood LBP concentrations on day 3, they were already 2.5 times greater than their healthy controls. So the same thing, inflammation far precedes the clinical diagnosis of a disease. And this immune activation, it's a subsequent inflammation, I think has a huge impact on transition cows, specifically its role in suboptimal dry matter intake. Everyone on this webinar is familiar with inflammation causing a reduction in feed intake. This is a highly conservative response amongst all species. Even a cricket, if you cause a cricket to be sick, it will reduce its feed intake. So it's from the simplest organisms all the way up to humans. And we know that cows that have the highest amount of inflammation have the lowest amount of dry matter intake. We've known this now for 21 years. And we also know that the cows that have the highest amount of inflammation also have the largest amount of non-esterified fatty acids and BHB because of the reduction in feed intake. I think inflammation is the simplest and most logical explanation for why some cows don't eat well before and after calving. I'm not talking about regulation of feed intake once established lactation has been attained. I'm talking about the transition period. Inflammation and reproduction. I got this slide from a former master's student of mine, Mackenzie Dixon, who got her PhD with John Brumfield at the University of Florida. And this is a collection of data that was generated at the University of Florida and with Martin Sheldon's lab in the UK, essentially showing that LPS, either coming from metritis or really any origin, has negative consequences on a variety of metrics of reproduction from multiple angles. What about hypocalcemia? Well, of course, the dogma is that milk uptake of calcium is so extensive, so quick, so acute, that it exceeds the homeostatic capacity to replenishment, and that we should have our industry and academic goals. We need to minimize this. And of course, we have essentially minimized or reduced clinical milk fever, right? Yeah, I would say that's one of the largest contributions that nutritionists have contributed to overall animal health. And we owe a huge gratitude for a scientist named Ron Horst. Ron Horst is an incredibly productive, impactful scientist. His H factor is 90. That is just an amazing contribution and impact on the dairy, on science in general. But Dr. Horst, Ron Horst, and his students and collaborators discovered not only the biology of milk fever, but importantly, they figured out how to prevent it, right? And if you are using some type of pre-calving calcium strategy, you should thank Ron and his collaborators for that. So obviously, clinical hypocalcemia or milk fever needs a pre-calving dietary strategy. And again, I've already mentioned it. It's probably the biggest contribution of nutrition to overall animal health in the last 40 years. Arguably the biggest contribution to overall animal health, regardless of whether or not it's nutrition or a pharmaceutical intervention. So clinical hypocalcemia, even if you have a pre-calving dietary calcium strategy, requires immediate intervention. We all know that. I'm not saying that. I've been accused of saying that before. A clinical milk fever cow needs immediate intervention. The question I'm challenging is subclinical hypocalcemia pathological? Is it detrimental to health, productivity, and profitability? Well, this is a nice paper from Nina Van Keizer-Link's group. They retrospectively classified cows within the first couple of days of lactation as being normal or healthy, not having subclinical hypocalcemia, or animals that did. And the control animals that did not have subclinical hypocalcemia are in black, and the ones that did have subclinical hypocalcemia are in the gray triangles. And this is milk yield on the y-axis. Remember, I think it's incredibly important to utilize milk yield as a marker of overall health. So if subclinical hypocalcemia is pathological, then why and how would subclinical hypocalcemic cows produce more milk? To me, it doesn't add up. And this is a paper out of the Cornell group looking at patterns of hypocalcemia in heifers and in cows following calving. And so this is calcium on the left y-axis, and here we have milk. And I want to draw your attention to two or three different patterns. Here we have in orange these cows that become pretty severely subclinical hypocalcemic in orange, and they bounce back within the first couple of days of lactation. And now look at their milk yield. right? These are the cows that go on to produce a substantial amount of more milk than the healthy controls supposedly do. Here we have 50 kilograms and 43 kilograms, 7 kilograms. That's about 16 pounds of milk. 16 pounds of milk between these cows that were transiently subclinical hypocalcemic versus the cows that had very low levels of subclinical hypocalcemia. So clearly there are patterns and causes then for hypocalcemia, and each one of these patterns of hypocalcemia has a cause and, importantly, implications. So what could contribute to this chronic and delayed subclinical hypocalcemia that I showed you just a few seconds ago? Well, we've known now for over 130 years that immune activation can be responsible for clinical milk fever. These are some papers generated by veterinarians and scientists in England. So here's some facts. We know now that all transition cows experience some degree of immune activation. It's really only the magnitude of that inflammation that differs between a healthy and a relatively sick cow. And here's another fact. We know that immune activation acutely causes hypocalcemia. In the interest of time, I didn't have time to prove that to you. You're just going to have to take my word for it. So then I think it's reasonable to hypothesize then that some immune activation contributes to some types of clinical hypocalcemia. And we think it's these types, this immune activation-induced hypocalcemia that benefits from an oral calcium intervention. And that's based upon a paper we published in the Vet Science journal 3 years ago now. So let's talk about the evolution of immunometabolism. There are a variety of unusual scenarios and pathologies that are characterized by an increase in insulin, heat stress. I've already talked about ketosis, feed restriction, intentionally induced leaky gut. And if you cause an animal to be sick, it also has high levels of insulin. The reason why these are all strange, of course, is that all of these are associated with a reduction in feed intake. Reduction in feed intake should be associated with hypoinsulinemia, but that doesn't occur. In these particular scenarios, there's a reduction in feed intake and there is an increase in circulating insulin. It's strange. So why would an animal increase the most acutely anabolic hormone during a very hypercatabolic condition? Well, it's because leukocytes, immune cells, are insulin responsive and need insulin to acquire large quantities of glucose. And again, I don't have time to go through our experiments where we tried to estimate the amount of glucose an activated immune system uses. You're just going to have to trust me that it's a large amount. So again, I showed you this slide before where propionate is converted in the liver to glucose. Glucose is a precursor to lactose, and this drives milk yield. So during stress, you have an immune activation event. Now you have insulin concentrations going up, and now it partitions glucose towards the immune system. And you notice the mammary gland just simply doesn't receive the glucose that it needs. And so this is this hyperinsulinemia we got done talking about during these stressful conditions. That's why we believe there's this hyperinsulinemia. So again, I've showed you this, but importantly, this is not just an ivory tower debate. I think it has practical, pragmatic, and economic consequences. So I've showed you this already. I'm not going to waste your time on it. But again, it's important to recognize that in this model, this traditional model, these three things cause problems. Okay? I think we need to think about it a little bit differently. We think that increased NEFAs and hyperketonemia are caused by immune activation-induced reduced feed intake. I've already talked about how every single critter on the planet has a reduction in feed intake when it becomes immune activated. And we know that hypocalcemia is also a consequence of immune activation, and this transcends many different types of species. We think the low feed intake, high NEFAs, hyperketonemia, and subclinical hypocalcemia are symptoms. They're a reflection of a prior immune active stimulation. So in this model, we have I have 4 different immune activating events up here. I wish I would have put pneumonia up here, but anyway, we have one of these causing leaky gut, for example, causing inflammation. Now, we know that immune activation causes hypocalcemia. We know that the mammary gland has TLR4 receptors for the LPS, so we have a direct inhibition of milk synthesis. We know that immune activation reduces feed intake even in a cricket. I didn't talk about, because of time, but we know inflammation contributes to fatty liver. And we know that LPS can cause impaired reproduction. I showed you everything except for maybe the fatty liver stuff. We know it also, this reduced feed intake contributes to DAs, and now it increases NEFAs, and this contributes to the fatty liver, and it causes an increase in BHB, and you get ketosis. So you see here that these are no longer causing problems. They are a response to a problem. So let's talk about inflammation. So I'm going to have 3 cows: the healthy producer, a healthy low producer, she's a dog, a healthy high producer, she's making you money, and we have an unhealthy cow, a sick cow, metritis, mastitis, leaky gut, whatever. So you have inflammation in the low producer and the high producer, right? But here's our sick cow. Okay, now we're going to put it up here in the left. It's there for your reference. What about dry matter intake? Here's our healthy low producer, healthy high producer. She eats more, of course. And here's our sick cow. Okay, I'm going to put it up there in the second to the left. Milk yield. Here's our low producer, high producer, and our sick cow. Put that up there. Now, this is where it starts to get confusing. Non-certified fatty acids. Here are the low producers, high producers, sick cow. You see here we have a cow that 2 very different cows, a profitable, high-producing, healthy cow in green, and an unhealthy cow that's not making milk, but she has high levels of NEFA. And the similar pattern then is for BHB. Here's our low producer, here's our high producer, and here's our sick cow. Same thing with hypocalcemia. Here's our low producer, here's our high producer, and here's our sick cow. So taking a blood sample, you could get tricked into thinking that a cow is unhealthy, sick, immune activated, when in fact it's just a rock star, right? It's a profitable dairy cow. So I've already showed you this. Importantly, this is due to a decrease in insulin. Now we have the unsuccessful transition cow, propionate, glucose, but we have LPS coming from somewhere. Whether or not it's the uterus, the mammary gland, the gut, the lung, I don't think it matters. The immune system becomes activated. This directly causes a reduction in calcium, and it directly causes a reduction in feed intake. Now, the cow wants to make milk, right? It wants to make milk at the same time. This is where the early lactation cow is different than the late lactation cow. She becomes hyperinsulinemic. Why? Because now all this glucose is being made. We want to drive into the immune system. LPS and inflammation also contributes to fatty liver, and it contributes to poor reproduction. This is why the 2 disorders or the 2 negative outcomes that are most closely related in the transition period are ketosis and poor reproduction. Well, why? Well, it's because they're both caused by the same thing. So now we have 2 causes for ketosis: a high producing cow that spares glucose for milk synthesis, or the immune activated cow. She spares glucose not for the synthesis of milk. She's sparing glucose for the immune system. So the scenario is you have 2 cows in the fresh pen, this is just a hypothetical. They're both hyperketonemic, say 1.5, 2.0, 2.5. Well, the cow that has ketosis and she has high ketone, but she's not coming into milk. She doesn't eat very well. She's not digging a hole in front of her. Her rumen's not filled out. She doesn't look good. She may even have a mild fever. Well, you can treat her for propylene glycol if you want, and her NEFAs and ketones will go down, and you'll feel as if you've intervened. But somewhere, she's sick. She has an immune activation going on somewhere, and that's clamping appetite. The cow that has high ketones, but she's eating like a champion, she's milking like a champion, she looks great, and she doesn't have a fever, and she's aggressively coming up to the bunk, well, she's healthy. Right? She doesn't need propylene glycol. She doesn't need anything. She just needs to be left alone. So a real-world example is something that occurred at the Iowa State Dairy Farm not even 12 months ago. Here we have 2 different cows. The cow in black, days in milk on the x-axis, pounds of milk yield on the y-axis. So the healthy cow here is in black, and she is making 140 pounds of milk by the 14th day in milk. We have a cow that's sick, and I'll show you that in a second, but she's inflamed, that she's in red. So at the 14th day in milk, she's only making 60 pounds a day. She's a dog. She's probably never going to be profitable. Okay, and our protocol is to check for ketosis between days 3 and 5 and 11, 13 at the farm. And lo and behold, both of these 2 cows came up as hyperketonemic and were then treated with propylene glycol. Well, it turns out the red cow had metritis, diagnosed with metritis, and her activity and rumination collar are down here in the bottom right figure. So compared to the average, right, but when she got diagnosed with metritis, her activity and her rumination are substantially less than average. She's sick, and she's been seen by multiple veterinarians. Up here, the cow that is in the black line, her activity and her rumination are right on par, right where we expect them to be. She's got no deviations in really anything, but she's hyperketonemic, so she gets propylene glycol on the 14th day of milk, despite the fact that she's making 140 pounds of milk, right? So we got to ask ourselves, should we even be measuring blood ketones, calcium, and rectal temperature during the transition period? It costs money. It costs time. Of course, if you treat them, the treatment itself has some cost. There's potential to have improper treatment administration. I know it's low, but the risk is still there. And probably just as big for most dairy farmers at the moment is that labor is precious. And so you have an opportunity cost for that labor. So instead, maybe we need to pay more attention to feed intake and overall milk yield. And I know rumination isn't perfect for feed intake, but if you can couple rumination and activity and general appearance and milk yield, you should get a good assessment of overall health. High production can only occur in the absence of stress and morbidity. If she's milking well like a rock star and eating well, she's not sick. Immune activation causes inflammation. We know that all the cows are inflamed. It's just the magnitude that differs. We know that inflammation or high levels of inflammation appear long before clinical disease presentation. We know that immune activation causes hypocalcemia. I've never said it's the only cause of subclinical hypocalcemia. We know that LPS causes infertility, thanks to the guys at Florida and Martin Sheldon. And we know that all animals on Earth have a reduction in feed intake when they become immune activated. The immune system is pumping the brake on feed intake. We want to prevent that. And I think you would put the pedal to the metal. So remember this paper I showed you by Charlie Sniffen and those guys? And I was like, how could all these things be related? Is it real biology or just simply mathematical nuance? I think it's real biology because they're all created by immune activation. So I know I'm getting to the end here. Inflammation. The metabolic adjustments in minerals and energy are not dysfunctional. They shouldn't be considered dysfunctional in that we have to fix them. The real fix needs to be what's causing her to go off feed, immune activation. They're not to blame. Our effort should be in preventing immune activation in the first place. Management, minimizing stress, right? Overcrowding of the pre-fresh and the fresh pens, on-time feed delivery, etc. Hygiene. Keeping the pens clean, the dry up procedure, keeping the pens dry, pen cleanliness, dietary strategies, feed hygiene, GI tract disturbances like rumen acidosis and hindgut acidosis. I think there's strategies that aim to minimizing leaky gut. I can't say this enough. Profitable production is a consequence of wellness. If she's producing high quantities of milk and eating like a rock star, she is well. So you've seen cartoons like this, probably this exact cartoon where there's, the masses are following the simple but wrong answer. And in the complex but right one, you only have a few people on that path. Well, I've taken the liberty to change this a little bit. I think we've made our interpretation of the transition period too complex. Doesn't need to be. You don't need a PhD or DVM to recognize when a cow is healthy. If she's milking well, eating well, and looks good, she's healthy. So anyway, it's myself and Aaron Horst and Sarah Kavija on the far right there. Scott, I'm very appreciative to Balchem for giving me the opportunity to talk about our recent ideas. I'm also very appreciative of the USDA. And there's a variety of industry partners that I'm also very appreciative to and indebted to for helping fund these students. And then these students then have a chance to go out and have an impact on the industry. And I just tried to come up with, here we have an immune activating event. right? And this causes immune activation, which then causes these problems. And then these problems then are correlated with these immune activations events. And I've gone over my time, and I appreciate your patience. And I'd be glad to answer any questions or try to answer any questions I can.
New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Dr. Baumgard, first question. You know what? I'm going to go with Dr. Zimmerman. He says, excellent presentation, Lance. Additional thoughts on how to identify these problem cows if you don't have activity and rumination collars?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially some of these large farms don't even have daily milk meters. So it makes it even more difficult. But, I think it's training farm personnel to recognize healthy versus sick behavior. This isn't aggressive eating, digging a hole in front of them, rumen filled out. So just some old-fashioned cow-side animal husbandry skills, I think.
Very well. Dr. Knapp would like to know your thoughts on the role of feed mycotoxins on transition metabolic diseases, like effects on gut motility, relationship to DAs, and effects on systematic immune system, and the relationship to mastitis and metritis.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's probably a bigger issue than what we appreciate. I'm not an expert in mycotoxins or the consequences of them, but I know because we've dabbled in mycotoxins to try to recreate some of these immune activation events at the university, and have been in large part unsuccessful. But clearly we have mycotoxin issues on farm. And we're probably then getting immune activating events at the gut, and probably even post-absorptively. So I think mycotoxin contaminations can be a contributor to overall immune activation, and thus then the consequences of that immune activation would be similar to that of mastitis or metritis or etc. I think she's spot on.
All right. Holger wants to know your thoughts on inflammation and beef cattle.
I think that's the feedlot industry has an issue with receiving cattle, right? They're on the truck, they're stressed, they're fasted, they're probably also not getting water. They arrive at the yard, and 7 to 10 days later they come down with BRD. And so I think there's a strong connection between the gut and the lung. That's been described by other people as well. So this immune activation and inadequate feed intake, then once they come to the yard, I think is very similar to the transition period that we see in lactating dairy cows and even weaning calves. The biology is very similar amongst all these stressors, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
All right, thank you. Larry, I'd like to know, have you done any work or are aware of utilizing anti-inflammatory compounds in the transition period, such as aspirin and vitamin C?
Yeah, yep. So the groups have been looking at aspirin administration. When I was at the University of Arizona, I gave Banamine to the first 3 days of calving, and Bradford's group has been looking at aspirin as a tool. The NSAID, or the anti-inflammatory space, I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity there. We're still identifying what type of NSAID is needed and when it needs to be provided. Because right now, I think there's an enormous amount of inconsistencies in that literature, but I think that is some low-hanging fruit that we'll eventually get to.
All right. Next question comes in from Matteo. Thank you for a nice presentation. I have a question about the treatment of subclinical ketosis. In the literature, it is mentioned that cortisone is not indicated. If there is a central role of LPS in inflammation, should that not change this indication?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot too. I think, so we know cortisol is an immune suppressor. In fact, Dr. Mark Curley's group at the NADC utilized cortisol to induce immune suppression, right, to establish the model. So I think giving cortisol simultaneously when treating a subclinical hyperketonemia is probably a unwise decision.
All right. Next question is Ahmed. Can we say reducing inflammation will improve health and milk production, but at the same time, having less inflammation can decrease the ability of the animal to fight against disease? How do we explain this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So so inflammation is an incredibly key component of the immune response. So what we want, and I've heard Dr. Curley describe it this way often, we want a cow to have an inflammatory response, to peak, to have it very robust, and then we want it to go away. We want it to resolve. And it's the lack of resolution of inflammation that's really the problem. So he's right. Inflammation is an incredibly key component to an effective immune response, and I'm not sure we want to prevent it. Of course, we know, like for example, parturition. The act of parturition requires inflammation, and we know that tissue remodeling requires inflammation. So, for example, the uterus goes from a 50-gallon bag down to a Ziploc-sized bag within a week. Right? That whole process requires an inflammatory response to be successful. So, I think we need to not approach inflammation as, oh, we need to prevent it, we need to prevent it, we need to prevent it, because we don't want to always prevent inflammation.
All right. Next question comes in from Martin. Hi, Lance. Thanks for the presentation. To modulate or prevent immunoactivation during the early postpartum, which of the following should be your main target? Number one, immune system, the LPS, or the integrity of the cells from the uterus, MG, or DGI tract?
Yeah, I think it's the third. I think we want to minimize immune activation to begin with. I'm not even, so that goes back to management, hygiene, GI tract health. That's a nutrition issue, of course. Yeah, I think we want to prevent immune activation from the get-go. That's the lowest hanging fruit right there. And that is, again, mostly management issues, I think.
All right. Next question comes in from Dr. Alseth. Dr. Alseth, glad to have you on board here. He's got a word here I don't know how to pronounce, so we'll give it a try, Lance. He says, love the challenge to transitions, challenging my own paradigms. We think we like 15 milligrams of cyanocobalamin daily. Do you know what that is? Daily for the first 12 days in milk to drive dry matter intake and metabolism, and we think we see much less health issues.
Well, I'm not sure what that compound is. He might be talking about one of the cannabinoids. Some people from Germany and Israel are working on these cannabis-related compounds with regards to feed intake. So I think anything we can do to encourage feed intake after calving is obviously a good strategy. But I just keep going back to the original tenet here, was that immune activation decreases feed intake. So if you remove the immune activation, you probably don't need a pharmaceutical target molecule to increase feed intake. If you remove the immune activation, she'll take off eating like a rock star anyway. I'm not sure if I understood Earl's question or not, but
vitamin B12.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not very familiar with the vitamin B12 literature stimulating feed intake. Earl, you have to send those to me if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Vergaro is asking, with screening purposes, could be an immune test be applied at transition? If so, when and which?
Yeah, I think this is a great comment, Vergaro, because we have some data. My students have some data looking at dry period inflammation, and specifically this comes from Brady Gates's work. But dry period inflammation, and then those cows 60 days later after they calve, they are also the most inflamed. So the cows that are most inflamed at dry period are also the most inflamed at the after calving. So maybe we could even identify a cow that's going to be problematic 60 days before she even calves. And in fact, it would be very interesting to see, okay, let's go all the way back to when they were calves. Maybe we could identify a hyperinflamed calf. So you can identify them as, okay, you need to go into the milking stream. You need to go to beef. But I think that's a fantastic opportunity for us then to start segregating. Hey, you're going to, you need to go this route on the farm, and you need to go to a different route.
All right. Next question, back to Ahmed. How does the immune activation cause hypocalcemia, and how can we do future experiments to prove that immune activation is the cause of metabolic disorders, especially hypocalcemia?
Well, we and others have proven that immune activation causes hypocalcemia. A bigger question is why. Well, it's not really understood why. There's a hypothesis by other people, and I like it, that most of the way endotoxins are removed from circulation are via lipoproteins, and this is a process by which endotoxins are removed that doesn't require an immune response. So lipoproteins, of course, as the name implies, are mostly filled with lipids or triglycerides. And of course, LPS, the L part of lipopolysaccharides, is lipid. So they can get sequestered into these triglycerides, circulating triglycerides. And from what I understand, hypocalcemia allows that process to be more efficient. So then, of course, the lipoprotein will be taken up by the liver, and the liver dumps out the LPS into the intestine. So it is a way that which the animal can get rid themselves of the endotoxemia without having a massive inflammatory response to the endotoxin.
All right. Next question comes in from Verl. You indicate blood insulin concentrations as a key factor to classify healthy versus sick cows. What about IGF-I concentrations?
So IGF-1, yeah.
IGF-1.
That's right. The nice thing about insulin is it's very quickly responsive. It's very responsive, very quickly, within minutes. So that's why it's, I think, more reflective, acutely reflective of immune activation rather than IGF-1.
All right. We're getting pretty long here. I'm going to go with one more question, Lance.
Okay.
Ken is asking if hypoinsulinemia is a state of normal physiology, but immune system is function is dependent on insulin, and inflammatory events are normal at calving, are just too late repartitioning glucose to immune cells, and what can be done to change this?
See, inflammatory events are normal at calving, are just too late. I wonder what he means by are just too late. Repartition glucose to immune cells, what can be done to change it? Well, to me, I hate to keep harping on a simple way of thinking, but that's the way my mind works. We just want to prevent immune activation to begin with. Now, all cows have some mild immune activation and thus inflammation, right? It's the exaggeration, it's the extended, it's the lack of resolution that I think stems from immune activation. So in my mind, let's go back to the basics. Keep the dry pen, close-up pens clean and dry. Have our fresh pens, calving pens clean and dry. Don't overcrowd. Keep the stress level low. Don't vaccinate in the transition period. Prevent immune activation in the first place. I think that's where our efforts should be placed.
All right, and I'm going to fib and do one more last question.
Okay.
Matteo has one I think will work quite nicely. Is where should we focus on to actually prove this dogma shift?
Well, okay, I get asked that all the time, and I agree with that. It'd be great to prove a dogma shift, but I think I don't think the original dogma has ever been proved. In all due respect to many of my friends and colleagues, I just don't think that dogma was ever proved with controlled and intervening experimentation. Proving things is difficult. Here's what we know. We know immune activation causes hypocalcemia. It's not the only reason for hypocalcemia. We know that animals that have the highest amount of inflammation also have the lowest amount of dry matter intake. I don't know, Scott, if there is going to be a controlled and intervening experimentation that can prove one dogma versus the other, or one idea versus the other. But we've been hounding on hyperketonemia, high NEFAs, and hypocalcemia now for going on 35, 40 years. Maybe we're hounding on the wrong things.
All right, very well. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Baumgard, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email at anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars takes place on the first Tuesday of every month, with the top research and nutrition topics that will impact your business. We also include small ruminant, monogastric, and companion animal-focused topics throughout the year. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the upcoming topics and to register for future webinars. You can also access past webinars and search for the topics most important to you.
Well, thank you.